Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest for this series is Simon Ralston. Simon is an instructor in the Department of English at Langara College in Vancouver, British Columbia. We'll be discussing his new book called Prison Life Writing: Conversion and the Literary Roots of the U.S. Prison System. Life writing is a literary genre, mainly nonfiction, that, as you might imagine, tells the story of a person's life, including formats such as diaries, memoirs, and autobiographies. Simon's book is part of a life writing series published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, the sponsor of these episodes. In his book, Simon situates life writing squarely in the prison experience. He explores how prison life writing is influenced by institutional constraints, the notion that prisons at one time were intended to convert felons into more productive members of society, and the various ways men and women perceive their own transformation before, during, and after their incarceration. In this fourth and final episode, we have a conversation about the evolution of the U.S. prison system and how prisoners' narrative techniques evolved right along with it. We'll also talk about why, frankly, the tradition of prison life writing should no longer exist. We've addressed this slightly, but dive a little bit more deeply into sort of an historical look at prisons. The structure of your book offers a history of the U.S. carceral system using a couple of different periods, one being the treatment era, and then the more contemporary carceral state. I'm wondering if you could walk us through those two periods and that transformation as you see it.
Yeah. My introduction focuses on the kind of long history of the prison system, sort of going back to the late 18th century, really, when you have these sort of early ideas of incarceration as a method for changing people's behavior. And I track how that early narrative, which in many ways was a kind of explicit conversion narrative, how that becomes the kind of, steel and concrete of the institution, and then how succeeding reform movements, efforts to change the prison, which seems to happen every 50 years or so, really kind of recycle that idea. So rather than questioning the very nature of the prison itself and saying, maybe this isn't an idea that's necessarily going to work, instead people say, what we need to do? We need to make the prison better at changing people. So you have these kind of reformist tendencies consistently returning to the prison and trying to graft onto the existing narrative of conversion that keeps reappearing new ideas, new technologies, new sciences as ways to better transform incarcerated people and bring them back into society. Now, these efforts don't work. On the whole, no matter how hard people have tried to make the institution better at changing people in the way that they wanted to change them, it just didn't work for a whole host of different reasons. Now, the reason why I focus on this post-war period, the kind of period after 1945, is because you really have a genre of prison life writing emerging at this time. You have, starting in the 50s, you start having prisoners' autobiographies emerging and becoming published all over the place. There's a whole bunch of reasons for this. One is an interest in this in prisons. There's in the 60s, you have an interest in prisoners' rights. You have an interest later in Black Power. And so all of these things feed into an interest, a desire by readers to hear more about the stories of incarcerated people. But part of that is also because of something called the treatment era, which goes from, these are sort of very rough dates, let's say, after the end of the Second World War to roughly the mid-70s. And so the treatment era was this period that was laser focused on the idea that the institution of incarceration was there to rehabilitate people. Now, prisons are there to do a number of things, right? They're there to punish people. They're there to rehabilitate people. They're there to kind of hold them for a period of time and kind of control them and so on. But that focus on rehabilitation was really the central focus of the treatment era. And the idea was, efforts to use things like the social sciences, using psychology, especially things like group therapy, as a way to change people's behavior. And also to use education. Education becomes a kind of central focus of that period as a way to change the lives of incarcerated people in the way that would make them amenable for their release.
Mm-hmm.
So the treatment era, was also where you have, the technologies like the indeterminate sentence and the parole board playing a major role in trying to kind of define prisoners, trying to get them to change in the way that they wanted them to. So, as I mentioned with George Jackson, gets a 5 to life when he's incarcerated. He then has to do everything he can to represent himself as a transformed person, as the kind of person they would like to release, in order for the parole board to let him go. And so you have prisoners during the treatment era, doing everything they can to try and figure out how to represent themselves to the parole board so that they would see them as a changed person. And so it's during this period that you have both the kind of, this massive output of prisoners writing, in part because of the education system that was happening at the time, in part because of increased interest in prisoners' writings for a variety of reasons. But then you also have this pressure cooker for them to represent themselves within the terms of the institution. So you have this genre emerging. And at the same time that genre is emerging and coalescing and starting to define itself, you have this kind of need for prisoners to represent themselves as transformed people. So you can see how the conversion narrative during this period really becomes central to the genre. So the treatment era really starts to fall apart. I mean, was it ever fully implemented? No. Was it ever actually a system that was there to rehabilitate offenders in a way that was effective and that would try and kind of help them reintegrate into their lives? No. It was ultimately always a punitive institution, and one that made it significantly harder for people to reintegrate as a result. Mm-hmm. But the idea of it as an institution of rehabilitation really kind of disappears in the mid-70s. Ultimately, based on a study that there's this one study that comes to the conclusion that, quote unquote, nothing works. That no form of rehabilitation is going to change these people. So we should understand the institution as purely of social control and punishment. And the idea of rehabilitation, we should just get rid of it. So you have really the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, you have an institution that really, is still to some degree, making occasional efforts at rehabilitation, but is for the most part one that is wholly focused on warehousing bodies, on punishing people. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you also have laws like 3 strikes laws that are focused on attacking the drug trade, laws that are focusing most especially on Black people and other racialized communities in the United States that are starting to pack prisons. And so, when you look at the numbers, when you get to the mid 70s, especially in the late 80s, not late 80s, so the early 80s, you see the numbers of incarcerated people just skyrocket. It goes through the roof. So that's often described as the period of mass incarceration. And it's a period that in many respects we're still in. Numbers have dropped a little bit, but you still have people incarcerated at record numbers at the moment. So those periods are and the reason why I focus on starting with the treatment era is because that's really where you get prison life writing, as I mentioned, coalescing as a genre. Mm-hmm. And then that genre carries itself through up until today.
Does it change though? I mean, do you see any evolution in sort of the narrative technique based on the institutional change that you've just described?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you have certainly with the 60s and 70s, you have a kind of militancy, an explicit attempt to fight the system that really disappears once you get into the 80s and 90s. That the kind of drawing on the language of Marxism, the language of different revolutionary movements, the Black prisoners especially, as seeing themselves not simply as part of a movement within the United States, but seeing themselves as part of a much larger, even anti-colonial movement. That really disappears. So it's also important, as I mentioned, even during that period, people are still using the conversion narrative. What they're doing though is they're saying, here's how I changed from a petty thief to a revolutionary, right? The kind of George Jackson paradigm that I described before. And so that becomes a really kind of central narrative of that period. Even white prisoners like like Jack Henry Abbott, follow that same kind of paradigm. Abbott, who sees himself as somebody who is also fighting back against the systems of oppression that he sees himself as a victim of, also identifies with the narrative of militancy and militant revolution that George Jackson really helps pioneer. But so once you get into the 80s and the 90s and beyond, that really dramatically changes. It really falls to the wayside. And surprisingly, in recent decades, you see a resurgence of a kind of, just a kind of conversion narrative paradigm that is much less revolutionary and seems much less interested in questioning capitalism, in questioning the kind of systems of oppression, using the kind of language of, say, Marxism, the language of revolution as before. And so you have the kind of two that I look at most especially are Jimmy Santiago Baca's A Place to Stand and the aforementioned Righting My Wrongs by Shaka Senghor. And both of those are certainly aware of and speak to the way race and racial discrimination and white supremacy play a role in their lives. But they're not doing it using the language of, say, Malcolm X or George Jackson or Angela Davis. They're using a very different kind of language. So you have, for example, Jimmy Santiago Baca, who describes how he was incarcerated as somebody who was essentially illiterate, and how he slowly teaches himself to read and write, starts writing poetry, and then after his release becomes a fairly celebrated poet. And how that story of his transformation from an illiterate prisoner to essentially a celebrated poet is central to his life, and is central to that autobiography. And so while he describes how he, as a young Chicano man, is a victim of poverty, of racialized violence, and a history of that racialized violence, it nevertheless becomes very much a kind of individual narrative, a kind of story of his own journey, his own progression from one way of being to another. Interestingly, also in that story, one thing that I find troubling is how this transformation that he describes from being a kind of illiterate person to being a celebrated poet while he's incarcerated also follows a bizarre, I shouldn't say bizarre, it follows a kind of peculiar narrative of transforming from animality to humanity. He describes going from somebody who was enshrouded in what he calls primitive manhood, somebody who's kind of fully guided by his desires, who is perfectly comfortable with violence and brutality, to somebody through reading and through writing starts to learn how to become somebody who rejects violence, who doesn't act out of violence, somebody who understands himself as sensitive and empathetic. Now, of course, that's kind of a classic civilizing narrative, right? Somebody who learns to read and write, who rejects the kind of some kind of savage animality, and becomes kind of a rational human being is a very old story. It goes back to the 18th century. So you have him using this narrative, and one might ask, so why does that matter? Why is that a problem? Well, in many ways, it's a problem because at the same time that you have Baca represent himself as somebody who's transforming from this kind of animality to this rational humanity, you also have him in the exact same moment representing other incarcerated people as animalistic. So I describe it as like a bucket passing its counterweight in a well, right? The more he rises according to this civilizing logic, the more he represents other incarcerated people as animalistic and brutal and violent and unthinking and irrational. And so that kind of follows a narrative that, as I mentioned, is quite old, but also represents incarcerated people in a way that I think allows for a kind of state violence to be done to them. Right? If they're animalistic, well, then they can be treated like animals. If they're unthinking and irrational, well, then they don't deserve to be changed and transformed. And that's very much still, I think, a kind of a strong narrative in American culture, a way of representing especially racialized incarcerated people. Now, as I mentioned, Shaka Senghor's story, does something quite different. But you have him using this transformation, this very kind of old school Malcolm X like transformation of somebody who, learns to, educates himself and transforms himself once he gets out, and then uses that experience of incarceration in this very, very neoliberal way to kind of make himself marketable, make himself sellable, and make his prison experience a kind of a commodity. And that the kind of lefty in me is very suspicious of that, but it also is very different from the earlier traditions of certainly of George Jackson, but of other writers of the 60s and 70s who were really critical of capitalism and believed that the criminal justice system was a system that served capitalist enterprises and capitalist needs. And so you have writers like Shaka Senghor really kind of buying into the story of the Black entrepreneur rather than criticizing capitalism as something that plays a role in white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. Great. So the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer reinvigorated discussions of prison reform and prison abolition. And I'm wondering if you see any relation between, broad-based social movements like that and prison life writings and or conversion narratives. Is there tension there as you sort of, in this case, kind of eliminate the institutional pressure, I guess, or influence on the writing versus the social? What maybe this is more of a forward-looking kind of thought process here, but what do you see sort of next for this genre of writing?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to say I'd like to see this genre not be around anymore.
Yeah, right.
And it's one of the things the Black Lives Matter movement is really focusing on is the role of the criminal justice system in maintaining white supremacy and its attack on Black lives and its attack on Black communities. So I'd love to be able to say, in 20, 30 years, we're no longer going to have a tradition of prison life writing. We'll have a tradition of people who are treated fairly within a criminal justice system. And so this story that we see will somehow disappear. I would love to see that happen. If we think of prison life writing as part of a long tradition of Black resistance to white supremacy in America, we can see it as part of, and likewise the Black Lives Matter movement as not kind of emerging out of nowhere, but also having this long tradition of resistance, a long tradition of a long culture of resistance to white supremacy. We can certainly trace it back to the abolition movement. We can trace it to early resistance to the way that the criminal justice system was used to attack Black people and keep them in positions of subservience. We can see it as part of the civil rights movement. We can see it, as I've already mentioned, with figures like George Jackson. When you get to the civil rights movement, but also Black Power, you have a really central role of the prison during that period, right? Where prisoners were understood as part of the vanguard, as really the people who were going to potentially even lead these movements of resistance to white supremacy. Now, I don't see prisoners necessarily playing a similar role now. And yet you have, I think, because the Black Lives Matter movement is correctly focusing so much on the way the criminal justice system has really reproduced the logic of say, Jim Crow, right, of the segregation system, how there's a focus on the role of the criminal justice system of maintaining the second class status of Black people and doing real violence to Black lives. I think the literature from the prison is one of the places where we can continue to hear a resistance to that system. Now, the resistance is in a different language. One of the books that I talk about at the end of prison life writing is Susan Burton's book, Becoming Ms. Burton. And it's a classic conversion narrative. She describes how she used to be one way and then she transforms into being somebody else. The book itself is kind of divided into these two different components, these two different pieces. Where on the one part, part one is called Sue, right? And that's the kind of the pre-conversion period. And then part two is Ms. Burton, right? Where she's kind of become this other person. And in this book, what's fascinating is that, it's an example of a woman using the conversion tradition, right? As I mentioned, that rarely ever happens. And yet she uses the conversion tradition in this really fascinating way. Now, I argue that she's actually not using the prison conversion tradition so much as she's drawing on the Alcoholics Anonymous 12 Steps program, which is itself a conversion paradigm, a way of transforming yourself from one way to another. And I think because she's using the AA conversion paradigm, what she's doing is, rather than say showing how she's transformed herself and left the prison behind and become somebody who's radically different from the kind of person she used to be, in this bizarre paradox, she's describing herself as leaving the prison and becoming somebody new, but also the somebody new who is still at the same time always like those people who are still incarcerated, who are like the person that she used to be. Now, that's a weird paradox, right? I am a different person and yet similar to the person I used to be. But it's a paradox that's quite central to the AA tradition. So in AA, somebody, in that conversion process, it's not that they become not an alcoholic, right? They become an alcoholic of a community of alcoholics. So they've transformed into somebody who is sober, but they're a sober alcoholic, and they never kind of let go of their kinship with other alcoholics who are struggling. And part of what people do in AA is they do service. They go to hospitals to help alcoholics. They reach out to other alcoholics. And that kind of that evangelizing is part of maintaining their own sobriety. And we see Burton using that tradition in her autobiography, but using it as a way to represent the lives of other incarcerated women. So what she describes is first her story, and how she managed to become sober, how she managed to essentially, get away from the claws of the prison industrial complex, but also how she maintains this connection with other incarcerated women and sees herself in their own lives. Now she works as an advocate for formerly incarcerated women, and her whole life is built around helping formerly incarcerated women. And so she hasn't really left the system. Well, she's left the system, but she's still working with and against that system as a way to help make incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women's lives better. But what's interesting is central to that story, and what I realize is also central to the conversion tradition and many of the other stories that I've read, is other people. One of the things that she's saying helps other people better reintegrate into normal society, however we want to define that, is love, is the love and attention and care of those who are on the outside, of formerly incarcerated people, of family members, of community members. And that's the thing that is central in a way to the conversion tradition, but part of what is often kind of in the shadows a little bit, I think. The fact that somebody doesn't just convert, entirely on their own. Someone else has shared stories with them. Jimmy Santiago Baca gets, someone is sending him books, right, when he's in lockup. Jack Henry Abbott starts a letter writing with Norman Mailer, right, and Jerzy Kaczynski and a bunch of other writers. His transformation involves other people. Central to the stories of Assata Shakur and Angela Davis is the role of the people, right, and how they see themselves as kind of part of this wider movement, and how that wider movement takes care of them, takes care of their families, helps support them in their time of need when they're incarcerated, and helps them when they get out, if they get out. And so I think one of the things that we can see for it, our kind of current moment, and I think that Becoming Miss Burton does a great job of really shining a light on, is our role, the role of people who are not incarcerated in both fighting the prison system and the damage that it can do and does to people's lives, but also helping people rebuild their lives and rebuild those connections. And how that's also been really part of the conversion tradition, although it's a tradition that hasn't often been recognized, and one that I think Burton does a really good job of foregrounding in her book.
Excellent. All right, well, that's all the time we have. Simon Ralston, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Wonderful. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You just heard from Simon Ralston. Simon is an instructor in the Department of English at Langara College in Vancouver, British Columbia, and he's the author of Prison Life Writing, Conversion and the Literary Roots of the U.S. Prison System, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, the sponsor of this series. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.